Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this current affairs lecture by Radboud Reflects, the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Affairs and Fox. Great to see you all again, just like 2 weeks ago. This is the first of our series on the war in Ukraine. And this afternoon we'll be listening to political philosopher Evert from the Zweerde about the ideas that shape Putin's mind and what motivates him. So we're diving into Putin's ideology. I'm not going to say much more. We're going to listen to Evert for about half an hour, and then there's ample room for questions from you, the audience. So without further ado, I give the floor to Evert van der Zweerde.
Okay, welcome everybody. While this lecture is clearly triggered by the ongoing military conflict in Ukraine, it is not about this war, but about part of its background and perhaps its roots. 2 caveats and a take-home message for starters. Take-home message: who would be so crazy to equate the Netherlands or Dutch society with its prime minister or with its king? Who would be stupid enough to say 2 years ago, USA is Donald Trump? Nobody. Then why act or think as if Russia is a single entity that does or want certain things? Or think or speak about the Russians as if they are a monolith? Caveat. First, I personally have strong ties with Russia, and I know many Russians, personally and professionally. I love the people, I love the culture, I love the language and the cuisine, and I'm fascinated by the philosophers. From that angle, I try to understand what is going on, which is not the same as being understanding, let alone justifying what the current Russian administration is doing. Caveat 2, my perspective is that of a political philosopher who has been working on philosophy in Russia for 40 plus years. So I'm not a Kremlin watcher, a journalist or a political scientist or a specialist in international relations, or a party in this conflict for that matter. And I recently finished a book. I put it on the slide, it will appear in June, which is about Russian political philosophy. What I try to do is understand what is going on at the level of concepts and ideas and share some of that. Understand things out of their own causes. So I will not say anything about the military conflict as such, nor about the battle about words that surrounds it. The fact that the Russian side is framing it as a special military action should, however, give the Dutch some food for thought. The parallel with the politionele acties in Indonesia in 1947-48 are striking enough and in fact send a similar message. Also, I will not say anything about the shocking hypocrisy of an European Union which welcomes, if need be, millions of refugees because they are family, a quote from the Dutch Prime Minister, or because they belong to us, a quote from the President of the European Commission, while having pushed back thousands of refugees not so long ago on the Mediterranean and the border with Belarus. People who happen to have either the wrong religion or the wrong skin color, or both. Nor will I say anything about the manifest effect, welcomed by many, of this conflict on the political and military unification of the European Union, or on the sense of relief that we at last have an evil empire again. I think that any sensible person understands that our enemy is neither Russia nor the Russians, and not even Mr. Putin as such, but the current policy of the current administration in the Kremlin. So my focus will, instead of all these things, be very modestly on Putin and on ideology. A bit of theory, a little bit of theory. What is ideology? I depart here from authors like Gramsci, Louis Althusser and Laclau Mouffe. Ideology is idea talk, connected to practices and to asymmetrical power relations. For example, when a professor tells students that they have to invest in their CV. This prepares future members of society to, a quote by Althusser, to walk all by themselves. It's an indispensable part, ideology, of the reproduction of hegemony in a given society. Hegemony is the soft part of a pair of which domination is the hard part. But they are not alternatives, they are complements. Every society is divided. And the current domination or hegemony pair is opposed by one or several counter-hegemonies, each with its ideology that is the determined negation, bestimmte Negation, of elements of the dominant hegemony. Internationalist versus nationalist, sustainability versus growth, collectivist versus individualist, etc. When oppositional, ideology is primarily motivating or inspiring. But once victorious, it becomes primarily legitimizing or justificatory. Think of Marxism, Leninism in the former USSR. The efficacy of ideology only partly depends on truth. It must have kernels of truth in order to work, but it can be very selective and manipulative. Its efficacy also depends less on adherents actually believing what they say and more on the filling of discursive space. Ideology, finally, is made up of what I call ideologemes. I take that notion from authors like Bakhtin, Julia Kristeva, Frederick Jameson, as its smallest units. Things like the free world, a worldwide caliphate, secularized society, Judeo-Christian roots, family of peoples, world of orthodoxy, human capital, temple of democracy, and Russian idea. If we want to understand what's going on, our question should not be what Putin wants, let alone whether he has gone mad, but what gives his idea talk appeal and plausibility in the first place, irrespective of whether he is miscalculating or not. And besides, Putin is not alone. Turning an enemy into a demon or a madman is to rely on bad causality, a bad understanding of causal relations. This is a cover of Polish Newsweek, Imperium Zła, which means the empire of evil. If we want to understand, we need to dig a bit deeper, which implies three ultra-simplified and partly historical excursions. Where does the idea come from that Ukraine actually is part of Russia? Where does the idea come from that Russia should be guided by a Russian idea? And where is Vladimir Putin coming from? A very quick look at the atlas. This is the Dutch Bos Atlas from 1902. On it you see the name of a country called Groot Rusland, Great Russia. And to the southwest of that you see a smaller country, but part of the large one, which is called Klein Rusland, small Russia or little Russia. If you zoom in, I don't know if this is visible, you get a closer view. You still see part of the Groot Rusland. You see the Klein Rusland, little Russia. And you see to the south of that, South or New Russia, which is the Nova Russia that is part of the current ideological framework of the Kremlin. So in 1902, the publishers of the Dutch Bos Atlas apparently had no problem with this idea of a new Russia to the south of Little Russia, and nobody was caring about calling it Ukraine or anything like that. So we do have a certain historical forgetfulness, if you like. Where does this all come from? If you look further back, and this one is better visible than the previous one, and you look at where Russia comes from as a country, you're talking about Rus, which is the earliest name of the country. And it started roughly here, Ladoga, Novgorod, those are the first cities that have historical records, and then the center of gravity moved south to Kiev, which for a long time was the main city in so-called Kievan Rus. As you can see, there is no Moscow on this map, right? Moscow would be roughly here, but it's not on the map yet. It didn't exist, or it was a little settlement, perhaps. If you look a bit later, if you look at the 10th, 11th century, this is a picture of this Kievan Rus divided into a number of principalities. Here you have Kiev, the main principality of this state, and still there is no no Moscow in sight. The first historical mention of Moscow dates back to the mid-12th century. A couple of centuries before that date, Kievan Rus was baptized, Christianized from Byzantium, and Christianity was imposed on the population of this principality by Saint Vladimir. Obviously, he became a saint because he did this in 988. If we move on, we're talking about a later period when, for roughly 2.5 centuries, most of Russia was occupied by the so-called Tatars, what we usually call Mongols. Some parts of Russia fell out of that domination, but Kiev certainly did, and it was sacked. During that period, towards the end of this Tatar occupation, or yoke, as the Russians like to call it often, Moscow gained prominence. And Moscow became the city, the new capital, if you like, of a new Russia that started to reconquer the other Russian lands. So for the first time you see Moscow taking central stage here. And this was the beginning of what we know as Russia's expansion, which took place in a very short period of time. Within less than a century, from Moscow, people had reached the Pacific, where now is Vladivostok. In less than a century, Siberia was conquered. Even Alaska was for a while Russian property. They later sold it to the United States for $1 million. That was just before gold was discovered in Alaska. Russians still very much regret this, this sale. So this huge Russia, covering 11 time zones, is already a thing of the 18th, 19th century, right? That is when it became this huge, enormous country. And some of the territories were later lost, others were regained. If we focus on Ukraine, and this is a map from the period of the revolution and the civil war, so the period roughly 1917 until the late 20s. What you see here, not all details will be legible for all of you, but you see here that especially on the eastern side of Ukraine, there's lots of shifts going on. Parts were given to Ukraine or were given to the Russian Federation and then given back to Ukraine. These borders, the eastern borders of Ukraine, are very much heavily contested. And they were so in that period, and they have remained ever since, in a way, at least at the level of the consciousness of people living there. This also explains why in this eastern part of Ukraine, most people speak Russian, and many of them are ethnic Russians, and they have relatives on the other side of the border, which is one of the complicating factors in this whole conflict. Ukraine, which literally means something like borderland, krai is border or limit, so Ukraine is the country on the border of this great Russian Empire. And this Ukraine has been shifting from east and west multiple times. If then you look at the later period, the late Soviet period, so after World War II, all of a sudden Crimea, which here is not part of Ukraine, becomes part of Ukraine. It was given by Nikita Khrushchev as a kind of, in 1954, as a kind of compensation for the so-called Golodomor, the famine organized in Ukraine by Stalin in order to suppress peasant uprisings in Ukraine. It killed roughly 3 million people. And Khrushchev was one of the persons responsible for this Golodomor. So as a kind of make good, he gave Crimea to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which at the time, being the Soviet Union, did not make much of a difference. It was a symbolic gesture, if you like. If you look at the legenda on the left, you can see that still this Ukraine was moving. It says things like, for the period just until World War II, Polish territory given to Ukraine. Romanian territories given to Ukraine. And then at the end of the World War, Hungarian Transcarpathia, Romanian islands and Russian Crimea given to Ukraine. It's clear who was doing the giving, right? All of this ended, the Soviet Union ended around 1991, when the former Soviet Union was carved up at the initiative of the 3 presidents of the Russian Federation, Belarus and Ukraine, who decided to leave the borders between those 3 Soviet republics intact, meaning that Crimea stayed with Ukraine, against the explicit wish at the time of the population of Crimea. Now, of course, all this this is the umpteenth story about borders and shifting borders and historical reference, etc. Clearly, none of this justifies an invasion or a war, but it frames the way in which people look at the world. Adding to this one point, going back to this baptism of Kiev, you see here 4 Vladimirs. 2 Vladimirs, 2 statues of Saint Vladimir, one on the shores of the Dnieper in Kiev, established 1853, and one in Moscow, very close to the Kremlin, and a huge statue of Saint Vladimir in 2016, when Crimea was already annexed and the president of the Russian Federation, not accidentally, is also called Vladimir. So there is a clear message sent there. And the presidents of both countries are called Vladimir. Volodymyr is the Ukrainian variant of Vladimir. Add to this one moment when Constantinople, the so-called Second Rome, after Rome, of course, right? When it fell in 1453, Kiev, occupied by the Tatars, was not capable of taking over this legacy, so to speak. And so it was claimed successfully by Moscow. And there is this story about Moscow being the third and, of course, last Rome, because there can only be 3, which has given the Moscow Patriarchate this kind of special status as the heart of Orthodoxy, the protector of Christianity, and especially of Orthodoxy. And after the rehabilitation, partial rehabilitation of the Russian Orthodox Church during World War II in 1943, when they were allowed again to have a patriarch, when they were allowed to reopen their theological academy, gradually Orthodoxy and the Moscow Patriarchate have started to play an important role in Russia's foreign and domestic politics, increasingly. So that's one. That's one excursion. And there's a first important element here. It's the idea of a great multinational Russia. It's not an ethnic nationalism, that's important to emphasize, led by the Russian people, which comprise some 80% of the population of Russia, but including Belarus, including Ukraine, and with Orthodox Christianity as its main religion, and the Moscow Patriarchate as the guardian of true Christianity, true meaning Orthodox here, against the onslaughts of the decadent, hedonistic, individualist liberal West. During his latest sermon on last Sunday, Patriarch Kirill of the Moscow Patriarchate clearly indicated that the litmus test for belonging to this hedonistic West or to the world of Orthodoxy is the gay pride. That is where you can see the difference. The question is not, I think, whether Putin or the Patriarch actually believes this, but if and why this idea talk, as I would call it, why it works, why it sticks. It fills discursive space in Russia, and it has done so for a long time already. Many Russians, in fact, share this idea, including many of the people who are critical of Putin's domestic politics, and including many who, if they know what is happening, would oppose the invasion of Ukraine. So it's much broader, much more widespread, this idea, than just the current administration. The ideology of a restored Great Russia does resonate among substantial parts of the Russian population. And the connected ideology of a worldwide coalition of traditional values, as opposed to the hedonistic, individualistic, liberal West, also resonates, and not only in Russia. Until recently, Poland was part of this broad idea of defending family values and things like that. Turkey fits into it. And there has been a period when the Kremlin was betting on this horse, so to speak, of building this kind of global traditional coalition. So we can agree perhaps that what Putin and his company are trying to do is problematic. But it is problematic for other reasons, I think, than the way in which Putin and his companions are trying to achieve their goal, right? We can be very clear about the brutality of the invasion, about atrocities, about human rights violations in Ukraine right now, but that's a different problem from the question, why would Russia or why would a Russian administration want something like that in the first place? Those are two different questions, I think. That takes us to a second historical excursion, the idea of a Russian idea. Russia owes this idea to Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was the first to explicitly speak about this in 1860. And with unsurpassed paradox, Dostoevsky places this question, the question about a Russian idea, in the mouth of an imaginary, fantasized Frenchman, whom he describes as, I quote, hoping that in the future the Russian idea will become the synthesis of all those ideas which Europe has worked out so long and so persistently in its own separate nationalities. All the later motives are there. Russia is expected to yield a Russian idea, which is not yet there. This idea is not anti-European, but, on the contrary, unites all previous European ideas. The very idea of such an idea, a national idea, is itself European, according to Dostoevsky. If Russia can come up, therefore, with a unifying idea, it will reunite Europe, meaning Christianity. But how such an idea should be articulated or where it should come from remains unclear. It's a promise, an idea à venir. Ever since, the idea of such a Russian idea has taken center stage, and I was quoting from my own book here. In 1888, Dostoevsky's younger friend, the famous philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, wrote a book, L'idée russe. Well, it's not a big book, a text, in which he wrote, it was in French, l'idée d'une nation n'est pas ce qu'elle pense d'elle-même dans le temps, mais ce que Dieu pense sur elle dans l'éternité. The idea of a nation is not what that nation thinks of itself in historical time, but what God thinks about it in eternity. This may sound very modest, but in fact it makes the Russian idea even more mysterious, because the question becomes, who then is entitled to claim to know what God is thinking? Moreover, it went along with, in the case of Solovyov, with a theory about great nations for which great unifying ideas are reserved, and small nations, such as the Poles or the Jews, populating what now is Ukraine, who had smaller roles to fulfill. This idea has remained prominent. Other famous philosophers, including Nikolai Berlyaev to the left and Ivan Ilyin to the right, that's also their political orientation, have written about the Russian idea. And in all cases, it was about something grand, something messianic, something Christian, and something that required effort and sacrifice. Not necessarily war, but sacrifice. In 1917, this Russian idea was, of course, replaced by the Soviet idea, which shared many of its characteristics. So the ideology was filled with another content, if you like. Gradually, during the Soviet period, the initial Bolshevik internationalism was replaced by socialist patriotism. And the main architect or exponent of that was, of course, Joseph Stalin. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union had fallen apart, the ideology of a Russian idea returned massively, this time combined with the idea of an ideological vacuum that urgently needed to be filled. In 1996, a nationwide contest was organized to come up with a new unifying Russian idea. Western academia at the time was laughing, failing, I think, to see once again that politics is often more about perceptions than about facts, and more about effective ideologies than about hypercritical deconstruction. First, still about this ideology of a Russian idea. First, a thesis. The question is not, I think, whether there is a God, nor whether that God has a Russian idea in her mind. The issue is the reality, in human minds, of the very idea of such an idea, and the way in which it can become a motivating and, once part of a hegemonic framework, a legitimizing factor. As such, there's nothing Russian about this. Perhaps a pragmatic nation like the Dutch today starts giggling when it is suggested that there is or ought to be some grand Dutch idea. But this has in fact been different in the not-so-distant past, and even today. Other nations, the USA for example, are very successful in convincing large parts of their populations that they are guided by a grand idea, or dream in the case of the US. And if the US are God's own country, then that idea is obviously what God is dreaming about America. In the 1990s and early 2000s, two candidate Russian ideas were gaining ground. The Eurasian idea, that is, the idea of a third civilization between Europe and Asia, and the idea of an Orthodox world, led by the Russian Federation. Both ideas comprised most of the former territory of the Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union, but the Orthodox world was extending into Southeast Europe, whereas the Eurasian idea is extending to the east. I'll skip the rest of this slide and move to Ukraine again, or show Ukraine. Having used idea and ideology interchangeably, I should specify that ideas become ideologies once they are included in motivating and or legitimizing forms of discourse. For instance, the discourse spread by a church or an administration. And they become potentially dangerous, first, if they meet with little resistance, and second, if they have practical, including territorial implications. In the case at hand, they do. While a vast majority of Russians would, if left free on this point, reject the current invasion of Ukraine, I think there's no doubt about that. Many Russians are sensitive to the idea that Russia was indeed the country that lost most when the USSR fell apart. That it was humiliated repeatedly by the West, which is not a nonsensical idea, and that historically Crimea is Russian, at least more Russian than it is Ukrainian, which also is not a nonsensical idea. The problem at this moment is not in these ideas as such, but in the fact that they have become predominant ideologies in a country in which discursive space is increasingly filled by a single ideology, one that comes in a few variants: the Great Russian idea, the Eurasian idea, and the Pan-Orthodox idea. Even if even this would not per se be a problem, or more precisely might be a problem only for the Russians, it becomes a problem for neighboring countries and the rest of the world once a regime under pressure, domestic pressure, starts employing this ideology, partly perhaps for purposes of motivation and inspiration, but mostly for purposes of legitimization and justification of its actions. Actions which, I would surmise, are motivated not least of all by an attempt to steer attention away from domestic to international issues, under simultaneous denial of the international character of those issues. So, why is this happening? And this brings us to the last question, the third excursion: where is Vladimir Putin coming from? He was born in 1952 in post-blockade devastated Leningrad. Leningrad was in ruins, right? The blockade of Leningrad is one of the biggest disasters of World War II. He was secretly baptized by the father of the current patriarch, Kirill. And he said in an interview with the Irish Times, "When I was a few months old, my mum and her neighbor in the communal apartment where we lived took me to the church shown on the slide, without telling my father, because he was a Communist Party member. And I was baptized. This," he continues, "was not without a sense of humor. This was my first visit to church, and, as you understand, it is difficult for me to remember." He then studied in Leningrad. He made a career in the KGB, moving to the GDR, East Germany. And when, in the 1990s, he became a politician, because he no longer worked for the KGB, although he retained his network, of course. He considered the breakdown, the falling apart of the USSR, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, which, and this we have to realize, for a person like him is simply true. It is for him a fact of life, whatever we think about that. He then made a brilliant career in the 1990s in St. Petersburg and became president in 2000. Initially quite successful, thanks also to high oil and gas prices, but heavily contested since 2011, and fearful of the so-called trauma of Euromaidan in Kiev. Because, and this is paradoxical, precisely because Ukraine and Russia are so similar and so close, a Euromaidan in Kiev shows that eventually Russia can be democratic too. Russia can also have peaceful change of regime, etc. So the closeness of Ukraine and Russia in this respect are an argument that easily backfires. And there is something desperate, you could say, or something fatal about this whole situation. Okay, come to the last point, and then there's time for questions. Can we look into the mind of Vladimir Putin and those around him? There was a book a few years ago, 2015, which was called Dans la tête de Vladimir Putin by Michel Elchaninov, himself of Russian descent, and editor-in-chief of the Philosophie magazine in France, the pendant of the Philosophie magazine in the Netherlands. In this book, we read about Dostoevsky. We also read about Dugin. It was translated into English, as you can see on the right. And the book starts with an event that was, at the time, barely noticed in the West. In early 2014, on a New Year reception, Putin gave as a present to governors and other high officials luxury editions of 3 books. The Justification of the Good by Vladimir Solovyov, already mentioned. The Philosophy of Inequality, Filosofia Neravенstva by Nikolai Berdyaev, also mentioned. And Our Missions, Nashi Zadachi by Ivan Ilyin, also mentioned. And all 3 authors of books with the title The Russian Idea. Very different books, very different ideas of this idea, going in many different directions. Berdyaev on the left, Ilyin on the right, etc. Solovyov more in the middle. But it's a significant fact, and it was at the time not really noticed. Questions. Did Putin himself read those books? That's well possible. Was he inspired by them? Possibly. Did he actually expect those governors to read them? Very unlikely. What we can conclude, however, that he deemed it relevant and opportune at that point in time to hand out those books to those people, to make that gesture at a New Year's reception. Do we then learn from such a book what is really going on in Putin's mind? Of course not. But we can get an idea of what might be going on there. We can grasp the logic of the ideology at play, irrespective of whether we completely reject that very idea of a national idea, or whether we are inclined to try to understand why, even if we reject it, such an idea might have plausibility for others, including Vladimir Putin. So to conclude, I think that in our analysis in days and weeks, possibly months to come, we should, to my mind, do 3 things at least. The following 3 things, apart, of course, from accommodating refugees or sending aid. First, try to replace, every now and then, moral outcry and cheap condemnation by sober analysis, asking which objectives of Russia's foreign politics are, from a wider perspective, normal objectives, not exceptional ones, within the context of international relations. You may, of course, dislike international relations generally, but you cannot blame the Russians for that. And not wanting to have your perceived potential enemy on your doorstep is not in itself absurd. Nor is wanting to regain territory that was lost due to 2 stupid mistakes. One in 1954 by one of the most impulsive world leaders ever, Nikita Khrushchev. The other in late 1991, when 3 estate-dividing presidents decided to leave the borders between ex-Soviet republics intact in spite of the explicit wish of the population of Crimea. Distinguish also the what from these objectives from the how, and also from the question if ultimately the Russian regime will succeed. Second point, take ideas seriously, especially those that strike you as absurd, without, of course, taking them literally, but knowing very well that ideas can become ideologies in motivating and legitimizing ideological constructions, which we do have every reason to take seriously. Third point, continue to make the crucial distinction between the Russians and the current administration and maintain, where necessary and where possible, where necessary and possible, re-establish personal contacts and professional exchange. If we cry that ordinary Russians should not become the victims of sanctions, knowing very well that they will, we could try to compensate for that with communication and solidarity with Russians, and concretely at a university like this, by welcoming Russian students and academics who no longer feel safe in their own country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evert. Okay. I'm sorry, but we have to wrap up the conversation. Evert, thank you for being here, for shedding your light. And yes, that indeed deserves another round of applause.